"Don't go to that podium, Mr. Hale. That dinner is not what they told you it was." The words were barely a whisper, barely a breath, spoken by a woman holding a wine bottle, leaning across the shoulder of the most feared man in London, while a room full of powerful people looked everywhere but at her. Every camera in that hall was pointed at the empty podium. Every plainclothes officer had his earpiece in. Every carefully arranged piece of an 18-month operation was in position. And it all came apart because of a 61-year-old woman who sold roasted chestnuts on a street corner. If you believe that the most dangerous person in any room is not always the one with the most power, but the one who has been quietly watching the longest, then this story is for you. Like, share, and stay with us. Because what happened in that dining room in Mayfair on a cold November evening will remind you that attention, paid faithfully and without reward, is one of the rarest and most powerful things a human being can offer. It had begun, as London evenings often do, with the appearance of civility. The private dining room of the Lantern Club on St. James's Street was exactly the kind of room that made ordinary people feel small and powerful. People feel safe. Dark oak paneling. Portraits of men long dead who had once decided things. Candlelight catching the rims of crystal glasses and the edges of silver cutlery laid with mathematical precision. A string quartet in the far corner playing something that cost enough to feel like silence. Peggy Marsh smoothed the front of her borrowed server's vest and tried to remember which table was due for a top-up. She was not supposed to be here. Not in any grand, philosophical sense, simply in the practical one. She had been called by the catering agency 2 days prior, told the assignment was a charity dinner in Mayfair, and offered a flat rate she couldn't afford to refuse. She had said yes, borrowed a white shirt from her neighbor's eldest daughter, and taken the district line westward with her shoes polished for the first time in months. She was here to pour wine and stay invisible. That was all. Peggy had spent 61 years becoming very good at invisible. She had grown up in Stepney, raised by a mother who cleaned offices in the city before the city had glass towers. She had left school at 16, married young, had widowed younger, and rebuilt her life the only way she knew, steadily, practically, without complaint. For 22 years she had worked Aldgate Corner, 6 days a week, rain and November dark, and the occasional August swelter that turned her chestnut pan into a small, fragrant furnace. She knew every postman on that stretch by name. She knew which cafe propped its door open when the owner was in a good mood. She knew the rhythm of the street the way a musician knows a piece she has played 10,000 times, not from the notes, but from the silences between them. Across from her corner for all those 22 years sat St. Aidan's Children's Hospice. She had watched it in every season. In winter, when the boiler was always somehow fixed before the cold arrived. At Christmas, when gifts appeared for children who had no reason to expect them. In spring, when the small garden out front was replanted with flowers that nobody had been asked to pay for. Peggy had never known who was responsible. She had never asked. In her experience, the people who did good quietly were the only ones worth trusting, and asking their names was a kind of intrusion they hadn't invited. She simply noted year after year that someone cared, and she thought that said everything worth knowing. She had not thought about any of this when she walked into the Lantern Club that evening. She was thinking about her feet, and whether the chicken would still be warm by table 4, and whether the agency would actually process her payment by Friday. She was not thinking about the silver-haired man at the center table who sat with his hands folded and his eyes absolutely still, the way a man sits when he has spent a lifetime making sure no one can read him. She was not thinking about him at all, until she recognized the face of the man standing near the back door. She had spent 22 years learning which faces belonged on that street. His didn't. And now he was here, 30 miles from Aldgate, in a room full of people who thought they knew exactly how this evening would end. but to understand why that face changed everything, why a woman who had no name for the man at the center table would risk the only thing she had left to protect him. You need to understand what that corner of the East End had quietly held for 20 years. And to understand that, you need to know who Edmund Hale was before the suits and the silence, before the fear, before the walls he had built around everything except the one thing he had never admitted he loved. If you believe that even the hardest people carry something soft worth protecting, something they would never say out loud, but would quietly bleed for, then like this story and subscribe before we go any further. Because Edmund Hale is about to prove that true in a way he never intended. Edmund Hale had not wanted to come. He sat at the center table with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that passed for ease, and he reminded himself, as he had twice in the car on the way here, and once more at the entrance when the warmth of the room hit him, that it was only one evening, one dinner, and he would shake the hands that needed shaking, sit through the formalities, and leave before the speeches grew sentimental. He did not do sentimental. Stuart Vane sat to his left, quiet and watchful in the way that had made Edmund trust him above all others for 15 years. Across the table, two members of the hospice board were deep in conversation about a proposed extension to the East Wing. Father Noel Birch sat nearby, his hands wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't drunk, his eyes bright with an emotion Edmund recognized and could not afford to share. The old priest had called him personally. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening, Edmund's private number, held by fewer than a dozen people in the world, had rung, and it had been Father Noel's voice on the other end, steady and warm and entirely without agenda. Well, the hospice is 25 years old this November. We would like to thank the person responsible. Just once, just briefly. For the children, if nothing else. Edmund had said no. Then he had said he would think about it. Then he had said yes, and hated himself mildly for the weakness. He looked at the room now the way he looked at everything, methodically, without sentiment. Children's drawings mounted in simple frames along the walls, crayon suns and lopsided houses and figures with enormous smiling heads, the way children drew people when they still believed people were mostly worth smiling at. The string quartet in the corner, the soft candlelight, the genuine warmth of people who had come here for exactly the reason they believed they had. That Edmund knew how to read the difference between a room performing goodness and a room containing it. This room contained it. That was the worst part. The trap, when it came, would be lined with something real. He had been 8 years old when his mother was admitted to a hospice on the other side of the city. He remembered the smell of the corridor, the single chair beside her bed, the way the nurses were kind but tired, always tired, because there was never enough of anything. She had died on a Wednesday morning in February, and Edmund had stood in that corridor at 8 years old and understood, with a clarity that no child should possess, that the world had decided she was not worth more than this. He had been 34 when he drove past the crumbling Victorian building on Aldgate for the first time. Already feared, yet already powerful, already the kind of man that other men crossed the street to avoid. He had looked at the building through the car window and made a decision he never explained to anyone, not even Stuart. He simply started paying. No name, no paperwork that led back to him, no visits, no acknowledgement of any kind. 20 years. And it had been enough. It had always been enough. Until a priest with a warm voice called on a Tuesday evening, and Edmund Hale made the first sentimental decision of his adult life. He reached for his water glass. Across the room, near the far wall, he registered the presence of Sir Gerald Ashworth without concern. Politicians attended charity events. It was what they did. It meant nothing. He looked back at Father Noel, who caught his eye and smiled with such uncomplicated gratitude that Edmund had to look away. He had built walls around everything he valued. He had simply never thought to build one around this. Sir Gerald Ashworth did not watch rooms the way other men did. Most men scanned for faces they recognized, for status, for threat. Ashworth catalogued. He stood near the back wall of the Lantern Club's private dining room with a glass of sparkling water he had no intention of drinking, and he read the room the way a chess player reads a board, not for what was happening, but for what was about to. 12 plainclothes officers, 3 camera crews operating under press accreditation his office had arranged 6 weeks ago. A press release sitting on a secured server, authored, approved, and ready to publish the moment Edmund Hale's face appeared behind that podium microphone. Everything was in position. Everything had been in position for 18 months. People assumed men like Ashworth acted on instinct, that power moved quickly, decisively, on feeling. The truth was considerably less romantic. Ashworth had built his career and protected it through patience so disciplined it bordered on obsessive. He did not move until the architecture was complete, until every exit was accounted for and every variable had been stress-tested against failure. He had begun with a single thread, a discrepancy in a property trust connected, distantly, cleverly, to Edmund Hale's financial network. From that thread, his team had spent 8 months unraveling. They placed a source inside Edmund's accounting chain, a quiet man, unremarkable, the kind of person who processed figures and was never asked what he thought about them. He had been remarkably cooperative once the alternative was explained to him. The fabricated documentation had taken another 4 months to construct convincingly. On paper, and it was very good paper, the anonymous donations flowing into St. Aidan's Children's Hospice for the past 20 years were not charity. They were a laundering conduit. Clean money out, dirty money repositioned. The paper trail, if you didn't know it had been built rather than discovered, was persuasive. The final piece had been the hardest. Ashworth needed Edmund connected to the hospice publicly and irrefutably, on camera, in his own words. Anonymous donations could be disputed. Yet a man standing at a podium accepting gratitude for 20 years of funding could not. Hence the dinner. Hence Father Noel's phone call, which had been suggested, gently, indirectly, through 2 intermediaries, by people the old priest trusted completely and had no reason to doubt. Ashworth felt no particular guilt about Father Noel. The priest was a casualty of geography. He simply stood between Ashworth and something worth considerably more than a hospice. Edmund's organization controlled 6 East End development contracts. Regeneration projects worth hundreds of millions, sitting in the hands of a criminal enterprise when they could be sitting in the hands of Ashworth's backers, who had been patient and generous and were running out of both. Destroying Edmund didn't require malice. It only required opportunity. And the hospice had provided it. He glanced briefly at his phone. A reflex. His daughter Claire's paper had run a piece that morning about council housing. Nothing relevant. She knew nothing about tonight. He had ensured that carefully. Claire was principled in the exhausting way of people who had never had to make genuinely difficult decisions, and he had long since stopped explaining his work to her. She was not a risk. She was simply absent, as she usually was from anything that mattered. He pocketed the phone and checked his watch. 12 minutes until Father Noel's introduction. 11 minutes and some seconds now. Across the room, Edmund Hale sat composed and unsuspecting, the candlelight catching the silver at his temples. 12 minutes. Edmund Hale had survived 30 years in London's most dangerous world. He would not survive the next 12 minutes. Peggy had learned to see by not looking. It was something the coroner had taught her. You didn't stare at people on a street. They noticed, and they changed. You kept your eyes on your pan, on your hands, on the small domestic business of your work, and you let everything else arrive at the edges. 22 years of that, and you developed a kind of peripheral vision that had nothing to do with your eyes. She used it now. The man near the side door had a camera bag. That was not unusual for a charity dinner with press coverage. What was unusual was the size of it, a hard-shell case that belonged at a film production, not a fundraising supper, and the way he kept his back to the wall with the particular stillness of someone who had been trained to wait. Journalists fidgeted, and they checked their phones and scribbled notes and leaned across to whisper to colleagues. This man had not moved in 20 minutes. Peggy collected 2 empty glasses from table 5 and moved toward table 7. The man there had a full plate in front of him. Chicken, roasted potatoes, a small arrangement of vegetables, untouched, all of it, the food exactly as it had been placed 40 minutes ago. He was looking at the room, not enjoying it, measuring it. She turned toward the emergency exit on the east wall. A woman stood nearby in a dark blazer, arms loosely folded. Every other person in the room was oriented toward the string quartet or their dinner companion or the children's drawings on the walls. This woman was facing the center table. Peggy set down her tray at the service station and breathed slowly through her nose. She thought about the silver Vauxhall that had been parked on Aldgate Corner for 3 consecutive Thursdays in October. Different driver each time, same plates. She had memorized the number without meaning to. It was simply what she did with things that didn't fit. She thought about the man with the camera who had stood across the street from the hospice one gray afternoon, photographing the building's facade with the focused patience of someone documenting rather than admiring. She thought about the woman who had stopped at her cart 6 weeks ago and asked questions about the hospice, when it was founded, who ran it, whether it had always been in that building. Questions that arranged themselves, in retrospect, into the shape of an interrogation dressed as curiosity. At the time, each thing had seemed small, unconnected. See, the city was full of strange behavior, and she was not in the habit of assembling conspiracies from inconvenience, but they were connected. She understood that now, standing in this room, watching people who were pretending to attend a dinner they were not attending. She didn't know the silver-haired man's name. She didn't know what he did or why this room had been arranged around him the way a lock is arranged around a key. She knew only what she had always known. Which things belonged in a place, and which things had been put there for a reason that had nothing to do with belonging. He was the reason, and the arrangement was not in his favor. The string quartet finished. The room offered polite applause. Father Noel rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man trying to contain his emotion, and then walked toward the podium microphone. Peggy looked at the silver-haired man. He was already shifting forward in his chair. She had 30 seconds, maybe less. She was a woman who sold chestnuts on a street corner. She had no power, no authority, and no reason to speak. She walked toward him anyway. If you've ever felt something was wrong before you could prove it, before you had the words for it, you already understand what Peggy understood in that moment. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe. Because what she said next changed everything. She kept her eyes on the wine bottle. That was the trick of it. Not looking at him directly, not breaking the rhythm of her movement. At not doing anything that would cause Stuart Vane or the hospice board members or the man near the back wall to register her as anything other than what she was supposed to be. A woman doing her job, refilling glasses, invisible. She reached the center table as Father Noel's voice settled into the microphone, warm and trembling slightly with the weight of the occasion. 25 years ago, a crumbling building on Aldgate became something extraordinary because of one person's quiet, anonymous faith in the children of this community. Peggy moved to Edmund Hale's right side, lifted the bottle, tipped it toward his glass with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing this all evening. Then she leaned in, kept her voice beneath the ambient murmur of the room, and spoke directly into his ear. She did not dramatize it. She did not whisper urgently or clutch his sleeve or do anything that would draw a single eye in their direction. She spoke the way she did everything, plainly, precisely, without decoration. She told him about the man near the back door. How she had seen him parked outside the hospice 3 Thursdays running in October, different occasion each time, same face. She told him about the camera bag by the side entrance, too large, too professional, wrong for the room. She told him about the man at table 7 who hadn't touched his food, and the woman near the east exit who was watching the center table instead of the podium. She told him about the woman who had asked questions about the hospice on Aldgate 6 weeks ago. Questions that only made sense now, assembled here in this arrangement. She did not tell him what it meant. She only told him what she had seen. Then she straightened, set the bottle down, and stepped back to the service station. Edmund Hale did not move. His expression did not change. His hands remained folded. His eyes stayed forward on Father Noel at the podium, as though he were simply a man listening to a speech about something that mattered to him. But his mind had gone very quiet, the particular quiet that preceded every decision he had ever made that counted. He had almost turned the car around twice tonight, the first time on Waterloo Bridge, watching the Thames go dark beneath him. The second time outside the club's entrance, one hand still on the door handle. Both times he had overridden it. Both times he had told himself that wanting to hide his one decent act from the world was its own kind of damage. That just once, so he could stand in the light without it costing him everything. He looked at Father Noel, genuinely moved, completely unaware. Then he looked toward the back wall, and he looked at Sir Gerald Ashworth. And this time he did not see a politician at a charity dinner. He saw a man who was not watching the room. He was watching the clock. Edmund picked up his napkin, folded it once, set it beside his plate. He rose, moved to Father Noel's side, and touched the old priest's arm gently, interrupting the introduction with the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice in his life. He explained warmly and briefly that an urgent private matter required his immediate attention. He wanted Father Noel to know that the hospice would receive double its usual contribution by morning, without fail. He shook the priest's hand, smiled, and meant some part of it. Then he walked toward the kitchen. Stuart fell into step beside him without being asked. Neither of them spoke. Edmund did not look back at the podium, or at Ashworth, or at the empty chair that would tell the whole story in his absence. Behind him, he heard Ashworth's stillness change quality, felt it almost. He kept walking. The most dangerous man in London walked out through a kitchen door, carrying nothing but the quiet certainty that someone he had never met had just saved his life. 4 minutes passed. Ashworth knew because he counted them. It was the kind of discipline that had served him for 30 years in rooms where composure was currency. You did not check your watch visibly. You did not let your expression shift. You simply counted and waited and trusted that the architecture held. And at 4 minutes and 30 seconds, his aide materialized at his elbow. "He's not coming back," the man said, barely moving his lips. Ashworth said nothing. The press release required footage. The footage required Edmund Hale at the podium, face visible, voice recorded, connection to the hospice established beyond contestation. Without that single minute of film, 18 months of fabricated financial documentation was circumstantial at best and professionally catastrophic at worst. A constructed narrative with no anchor, floating free in a courtroom where defense barristers would dismantle it, thread by thread. Father Noel had recovered gracefully at the podium, pivoting to a general tribute that drew warm applause from people who had no idea what had just failed to happen around them. The cameras were still running, they capturing exactly nothing of use. The 12 plainclothes officers stood at their positions with the particular stillness of men whose purpose had evaporated without announcement. Ashworth set his untouched glass on a passing tray and walked to the exit at a pace that suggested a prior engagement rather than retreat. He collected his coat from the cloakroom with unhurried precision and stepped into the November cold. In the car, With the partition up and the city moving past the windows, he allowed himself exactly 1 moment. His jaw tightened. His right hand closed briefly into a fist against his knee. Then he released it, straightened his jacket, and began to calculate. Damage control, containment. The source inside Edmund's accounting chain would need to disappear quietly, reassigned, discredited, rendered unreliable before anyone thought to ask him questions. The fabricated documents would need to be recalled from the servers before morning. It was recoverable. Everything was recoverable if you moved before the story found its shape. He did not think about Claire. Claire Ashworth was eating a desk sandwich at 11:43 when the email arrived. No subject line, a single attachment. The sender was an address she didn't recognize, but the document inside it carried her father's office letterhead, his operational code name for the project, and 47 pages of detail so specific and so damning that she read it twice before she accepted that it was real. She sat with it for 2 hours. She thought about her father, not the public man, but the one she had grown up watching across dinner tables. Oh, who had always spoken about public service with a conviction she had spent years trying to decide was genuine. She thought about the hospice. She had driven past St. Aidan's once, years ago, and remembered the garden, small, carefully kept, improbably cheerful for November. She thought about the children's drawings she had seen framed on the dining room walls that evening when she had stopped by the Lantern Club briefly to drop off research materials for a colleague at 6 o'clock before the dinner began. Crayon suns, lopsided houses, figures with enormous smiling heads. Her father had framed those drawings on the walls of the room he built the trap in. She filed the story at midnight, under her own byline. She did not call him first. Peggy collected her coat from the staff room at 11:30, thanked the catering supervisor, and then walked out into the cold. She did not know what had happened after the silver-haired man left. She didn't know his name or what the men with the camera bags had done when the podium stayed empty, or whether any of it had mattered in the end. She only knew that the faces that didn't belong had still been in the room when she clocked out, and the man at the center table had not. She turned up her collar and walked toward the tube, assuming she had done the right thing, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has never needed recognition to confirm it. She would never know how right. By morning, it was Sir Gerald Ashworth's name in the headlines. Not the word justice, not even the word truth, just his name, above his daughter's byline, and everything that name now meant. For 3 weeks is not very long for the world to move on from a man's destruction. But it managed. Sir Gerald Ashworth resigned from his parliamentary seat on a Tuesday morning, releasing a statement through his solicitor that described the resignation as a personal decision made in the interest of his constituents. The statement did not mention his daughter. It did not mention the hospice. It did not mention 18 months of fabricated evidence assembled to destroy a man whose only traceable connection to St. Aidan's Children's Hospice was 20 years of anonymous generosity. The investigation, his solicitor confirmed, was ongoing. Ashworth made no further comment. He had retreated behind the kind of expensive silence that suggested he was already preparing his defense and would not be rushed. Claire's piece had run to 4 separate follow-up articles by the end of the first week. She did not give interviews about it. When colleagues asked what it had cost her to write it, she said only that the cost of not writing it would have been higher. She had not spoken to her father since the night she filed. She was not certain she would. There was no version of that conversation she could construct, even now, that ended in anything she recognized as resolution. Some doors, once you understood what was behind them, simply stayed closed. She had received no communication from Edmund Hale's world. No acknowledgement, no threat, no quiet expression of gratitude through intermediaries. She had not expected any. She hadn't written the story for him. She had written it because children's drawings had been framed on the walls of a room her father built as a trap, and that image had not left her, and she suspected it never entirely would. Father Noel Birch issued a public statement on behalf of the hospice 9 days after the dinner. It was 2 paragraphs long and expressed, with simple and undefended honesty, his grief at having been used without his knowledge as an instrument of harm toward someone he had genuinely wished to honor. He asked for no sympathy. He requested only that the hospice itself, its children, its staff, its 25 years of work, not be diminished by its proximity to what had happened. The anonymous contribution arrived 4 days later. Double the usual amount, transferred through the same quiet channels it had always used. No note, no change in method, and simply the money, as promised, as it had always come. Father Noel did not know who to thank. He thanked God, which had always been his practice, and left it there. Edmund Hale said nothing publicly. He returned to his life the way water returns to its level, completely, without drama, occupying exactly the space it had always occupied. He gave no interviews. He made no acknowledgments. If the evening at the Lantern Club had shaken him, no external surface recorded it. Stuart Vane noticed one thing. In the 3 weeks that followed, Edmund did not once override his instincts. Not in business. Not in the small daily calibrations that running an organization required. Whatever the dinner had settled in him, whatever the near miss had permanently rearranged, it had made him finished with the particular vanity of wanting to be seen doing good. He had set it down in that kitchen doorway and had not picked it back up. Stuart did not mention it. He simply noted it and was glad. Peggy returned to Aldgate Corner on the Monday, following the dinner, to find her cart gone. In its place stood a new one. Solid, well-built, painted the precise green of the old one, but without the rust at the base and the wobbly left wheel she had been compensating for since 2019. Fully stocked, a folded apron on the shelf, her size. And on the handle, a small brass plate, the kind you had made when you wanted something to last. She leaned in and read it once, for 22 years of watching. No signature, no explanation. She straightened up, set both hands on the handles, and then opened for business. The morning came around her the way it always did. The lorries on Aldgate High Street, the first commuters with their collars up, the lights coming on in the hospice across the road, warm gold against the November gray. Steam rose from the pan. The first chestnuts began to turn, a city moving, a woman at her corner, everything exactly as it had always been, and entirely different. She had never wanted to be extraordinary. She had simply never stopped watching, and sometimes, in a world full of powerful men and careful plans, that is the most dangerous thing a person can be. If this story reminded you that ordinary people can change extraordinary outcomes, that attention paid quietly and without reward is one of the most powerful things a human being can offer. Then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like, comment, and stay with us, because the next story might be about someone just like you.